that's so true.
All
Fabulous.
right, we're live and recording. So, hi everyone and hi world to our next webinar today. And today we're actually talking with Tolu, or she will be talking to you about accessibility testing. So, thanks for being there, Tolu, and hi.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
And thank you. Everyone, hope you're all safe and fine and ready for this great webinar and this great topic. So before we actually start, just a quick announcement that, as you know, we're all online this year with our conference. If you want to learn more about everything, you can just click the button below and it will lead you right to our website where you can find out more about our great online conference and register if you want. It's going to happen in November, so there's still some time, but the earlier sign up, the better for everyone. So that's to that. Before we go into the session, just a quick reminder of how the whole thing here is working. So this is Crowdcast. For those of you who don't know, on the right-hand side, as you can see, there's the chat. Steffi, my colleague, is already posting things in there that might be of interest to you about Tolu's work and about the conference. You can say hi if you want. It's always cool to see where everybody's tuning in from, and of course, chat with all the others. If you do have a question, however, you can go to the Ask a Question box down there and post a question, or you can upvote for a question that's already in there. And after the session, I will come back on here and we will go through the questions. Yes, and that's pretty much it. And as soon as this session is over, the replay will be available in a matter of 20 seconds, I think. So if you missed anything, you can go back and watch it. All right. So also very, very important, a big thank you to our sponsor today, who is Taito Software with their product Sahi Pro. If you want to find out more, there's a link in the chat as well. Thanks to our sponsor for sticking with us and supporting us with the conference later this year. Okay, and now to Tolu. So we have met via a friend of us, Angela. She has recommended her to us, and we quickly jumped on it because we love the topic, and we met Tolu and thought it's just great to have her here. So thanks again for your time, Tolu, and for this for the effort you make to do the webinar today. And as you may know, she's a product designer and accessibility expert. She's particularly passionate, of course, about designing interfaces and designing products that are inclusive and accessible to everyone. She has gained some experience with that, with her projects and working for big industry names like Walmart, DHA Logistics, and Mercedes-Benz. You can read more about her projects and also about her experiences in her posts and her blog posts on her website, tolu.xyz. Link is in the chat. So have a look what she's done already. And we are pretty happy to have her here and to learn more about the manual parts of accessibility testing that are still necessary to ensure a smooth interface and smooth experience for all users. So Tolu, I'm now giving up to you before I talk more, and then I'll see you back after the session. And I'm just gonna throw myself out, and you can start screen sharing if you want. So see you all later and have fun.
Bye. See you in a second. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Thank you all so much for attending this talk. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about accessibility testing, especially the manual parts. Hey, Ina, I'm hearing a lot of echo. Is there anything I can do to fix that?
You can see if you, maybe sometimes it's because you have opened the second or another tab with this with the same with Crowdcast.
Okay.
So make sure that you just have one tab with the tool open. Otherwise, it might lead to an echo.
Okay,
Is it still
awesome.
echoing?
No, we're all good.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
Okay,
then I'm gonna
awesome.
jump out again. All right.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining me in this talk about accessibility testing, the manual parts. So just a little bit about me. Ina already introduced me, but just a little bit more about me. I'm a product designer and developer based in Toronto. I'm also an accessibility advocate and a plant lover, as you can probably see some of my plants in the background. So a lot of my career has been spent doing both product design and development, and kind of with that territory comes a lot of accessibility concerns, which is why I've done so much accessibility work. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've found happen most commonly, or kind of the most common issues that need to be manually tested, and why manual testing is so important. We're going to talk about a few different aspects of this, including accessibility testing, automated testing versus manual testing, automated testing tools, the kind of big problem that we face, and what you should be testing manually. So to start off, I'm going to define a couple of terms that I'm going to be using throughout this webinar, just so we're all on the same page. So when I say WCAG, I'm referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are defined by the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium that maintains international web standards. So basically, WCAG is a list of kind of like rules and guidelines that developers and designers internationally follow to make sure that the content that they're creating meets accessibility guidelines and is usable by people with disabilities or who use assistive devices to access the web. So success criteria need to be followed in order and interpreted in order to kind of adhere to the rule that they're referring to. So they're categorized by three compliance levels. So single A is kind of the bare minimum level of compliance, really straightforward stuff that all websites should be doing, things like having alternative text attributes for images. Double A is kind of a more advanced standard. It has a little bit more detail, some things that are kind of more labor intensive to remediate. But generally, this is the level of compliance that we all should be beating on this date in 2020. And AAA is a set of is kind of the set of guidelines that are a little bit above and beyond. And the W3C actually does not recommend accessibility kind of accessibility testers try and meet the AAA standard just because it consists of a lot of things that are hard to interpret, but also difficult to kind of implement in real life. So generally, when we're talking about all these things that we need to manually test, they meet a double A WCAG standard of compliance. So first of all, what is accessibility testing? Why do we do it? Accessibility testing is a really important aspect of testing. When we're releasing websites, web apps, we need to test them to make sure that they conform to accessibility guidelines and to make sure that they're usable for people with disabilities. Interestingly enough, your website can follow every single guideline and still not be accessible because of the way things are implemented. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. So automated testing is really good for flagging items, especially code and color contrast issues. So automated testing tools are generally really good at catching certain types of errors. They're kind of the type of errors that involve, for example, not having alternative text attributes at all, things like using a deprecated HTML tag. They're really good at catching things like that because those are generally pretty straightforward things that aren't open to interpretation. But when we get into the gray area of looking at things that are open to interpretation or guidelines that are less specific, we get into a gray area where automated tools have a lot of difficulty catching those issues. Manual testing is really important when it comes to that. It's important for testing the usability and more subjective things, like if the alternative text attributes are correct, if you have well-formed tables. There are certain things that no computer is ever going to catch. It's going to have to be a human being who goes through to test them, to have a look at them, to think subjectively about whether they're being applied in the spirit of accessibility testing or not. So there are a couple of schools of thought when it comes to adhering to accessibility guidelines. I like to call them the following rules school of thought and then the doing the right thing school of thought. The following the rules school of thought tends to apply guidelines and just end it there. So for example, on my web page, the code is well formed and I put it through an HTML checker, so I'm done. It's accessible. But accessibility testing, like making sure a solution is accessible, goes beyond just following the rules. Like I said before, you can have a website that is perfectly compliant with WCAG standards, but is not fully accessible. So how does that happen? That happens when guidelines are being followed, but practically the website is still difficult to use. For example, if you have a really confusing table with lots of subheadings, with lots of different sections, technically you can make that accessible. If your markup is well formed, if you're using HTML semantically, it can be accessible. But in the spirit of accessibility, um, it's so difficult to read or to kind of transverse as someone using a screen reader that essentially it's not usable. Then there's the other school of thought, which is doing the right thing. So I'm a big proponent of this school of thought, not just following accessibility guidelines down to the T, but making sure that your solutions are actually accessible and like would be enjoyable for someone with a disability to use. For example, if I have a website that's all about images, all about panoramic images, yeah, I can slap some alternative text attributes in there and technically it's accessible, but is it a good experience for someone who can't see who accesses your site? Probably not. I would really encourage everyone in this webinar to kind of look at the way that they treat accessibility. Do you just think about it as following the rules, or are you thinking about doing the right thing and actually stepping into the shoes of someone with a disability? Kind of making sure that our products are just technically correct isn't enough here. It's important to consider how good of an experience it is to someone with a disability. And if you're at all able to make those experiences equivalent, I would really encourage that and like spending some more time thinking about that. So what are automated testing tools? Now, automated testing tools come in all shapes and sizes. They're all different types. They vary widely in scale, but some kind of more easily accessed tools that some of you may be familiar with include the Wave Accessibility Evaluation Tool, the AX Accessibility Testing Tool, Xcode Accessibility Inspector, and Color Oracle. These are tools that help you catch things like simple mistakes in code or not having certain attributes defined or using ARIA labels incorrectly. They catch little things and they are helpful towards remediating accessibility issues, but only a very small subset of them and only a very specific kind. These tools are also great for catching color contrast mistakes. I would say that kind of the top use for automated accessibility testing tools for me is to test color contrast, something that a computer can do a lot more efficiently than I can, but is also really important to accessibility. So I would highly encourage you to look into some of these tools or other tools that help you automate some parts of the accessibility testing process. So automated tools can do a couple of different types of tests. So your most basic tools, the ones that we just talked about on that previous slide, will test one page at a time using a very specific subset of criteria. And depending on what kind of tool it is, it'll probably give you alerts as to what you can fix to make your page more compliant and to at least not have these errors present, which is a great start. Larger scale tools can test several pages at a time. They can record scripts. They can automatically fill out forms. They can automate tests, repeat tests. Larger scale tools, especially ones that have been customized, can do a much wider range of things. They can automate things that are very specific to a certain to a certain team's workflow, but they're only pretty much as good as kind of the amount of effort that was put into them and how many different use cases were considered. Now there are always going to be edge cases and unique kind of cases, and these larger scale tools aren't the best at finding that. It's just a script that runs and catches every kind of error that you're able to define and that you're aware of. So again, this is a good start. It'll call out certain errors, but it's kind of only as knowledgeable as the person who made or coded it. So, what can automated tools do? So, overall, we know that automated tools can reliably catch about 30% of accessibility errors, which isn't bad. That's a good chunk, and it's awesome that we have tools that can help us out with this. But what can't they do? They can't catch the remaining approximately 70% of accessibility errors. That's a lot of errors that automated tools are missing. Basically, these remaining errors need to be remediated and called out by someone who does have some accessibility knowledge. It can be tested for a variety of people, from designers to QA folks to developers to people who have disabilities themselves and would be using these products. So the problems with tools that claim to completely automate WCAG compliance. So I decided to include this specific section because it's a bit of a topical topic, and it's something that has been coming up quite often in the accessibility community recently. Um, there are certain tools that claim to 100% automate your website's accessibility within 1 to 2 days, purely using a JavaScript solution. Accessibility is a really prominent example of this. It's been in the media quite a bit, and accessibility advocates have kind of a variety of views on what accessibility is able to do. Basically, accessibility is comprised of a little widget that can be opened up, and then the user is presented with a kind of variety of options as to kind of the accessibility profile of the page that they're on. So they're able to toggle certain settings. They're able to fix things that were originally either not accounted for or had been done incorrectly on the original page this widget is on. So on a surface level, this can seem pretty helpful, right? Like when a page isn't accessible, in theory, it's great to have a little widget on that page that lets you make it accessible for yourself, that lets you adjust a variety of settings to make sure that it kind of aligns with the experience that you're looking for. But these tools are also pretty problematic. The JavaScript overlay that allows users to toggle issues related to accessibility, while it seems like a great feat of coding, it's just not in the spirit of doing the right thing. Why should users with disabilities be left with the responsibility of fixing pages that weren't created properly in the first place? I think that's pretty unfair. And as designers, developers, QA testers, it is our job to make sure that that experiences are designed to be used by different groups of users, and that includes users with disabilities. I think kind of forcing users with disabilities to make the page work is unfair and pretty ableist. And we also run kind of we run into the problem of some users either not wanting to or not being able to use this tool. So what happens then? They're left using a page that's essentially broken. Um, yeah, while these tools do seem intriguing at first, it's important to remember that they're doing more to further ableism than they are fixing it. Tools like this make unrealistic claims. There's absolutely no automated or AI tool that can catch 100% of accessibility errors. The technology does not currently exist. So companies like this are kind of selling something that isn't real. Using tools like this is a pretty good way of getting sued. There are already a couple of lawsuits against this company because it doesn't do what it advertises. There's also the issue of caching changes. So when you make changes using a widget like this, they tend to be cached in your browser. So what happens if you accidentally toggle high contrast mode, but you didn't mean to? You refresh your browser and high contrast mode is still applied. That's a pretty frustrating experience for users, but also requires a whole another level of effort to reset the page when this should have been taken into account when the page was being built itself. So kind of main takeaway from tools like this is that manual remediation is important and absolutely necessary. For now, with the technology that exists, we need humans testing certain aspects of accessibility. So some things that you're going to need to manually test when you're trying to remediate accessibility issues. One of those things is semantically correct code. So your markup might work and pass tests that you run through like HTML or JS or CSS linters, but are you using semantically correct code? So while these tools are equipped to tell you if your code has certain types of errors, they aren't really going to look at semantically correct code. If you decide to create a table made of divs, these tools probably aren't going to call it out as long as your divs are used correctly, as long as you have all your brackets closed, you're not going to see an issue. But there is an issue with this kind of code. Your code should be semantic HTML and have appropriate roles. So your page, for example, might look great and might pass through all the linters, but it's not coded properly and it doesn't meet accessibility guidelines if you're missing a language attribute, for example. Um, Kind of main takeaway from this is just because your markup passes a linter's test does not mean it's accessible. When we're coding semantically, especially with accessibility in mind, it's really important that we use our HTML tags as intended and stay away from using deprecated tags or tags that don't properly indicate to screen readers kind of what element the user is currently on. So further about semantically corrected code, there's kind of when you're coding, there's kind of like the school of thought where things can be technically correct and then they can be actually correct. So a lot of times we see it happening where we slap together code that is technically correct, that works, that you can tab through easily, that serves its purpose, the page looks good. But when you take a closer look, it's not actually coded in a semantically correct way. So for example, using divs to hide all different elements and then using CSS to mark them up to look like the elements that they're supposed to look like. While technically this code might pass tests, when you have a deeper look, it's pretty problematic and it wreaks a lot of havoc on screen readers. Screen readers are designed to pick up on certain types of HTML tags, so it's really important to use semantic tags that accurately convey what kind of elements you're actually trying to code. So yeah, this is a great example. Instead of having a div with the ID header and then using CSS to make it look like an H1, just use the tag header. Instead of having a div with an ID of nav, use nav. Just make sure that the different tags you're using correspond with what you're actually creating with your HTML. Another thing that you'll have to manually test are certain aspects of images. So things like making sure the alternative text attributes are being used correctly. I know I've said this a million times, but it actually is probably one of the most common issues I see on websites. So again, this is another thing that a tool can call out to a certain extent. A tool can call out if you have alternative text attributes present, but it can't really tell you whether you're using them correctly because that kind of requires a certain level of knowledge of what the images are. So overall, your alternative text attribute should should describe what's in the image briefly. Um, Alternative text attribute probably should not be used when you have a giant infographic that has a ton of different information. There are other kind of solutions to that, but alternative text is not one of them. So it should be no more than 125 characters, which there isn't really a hard and fast rule about how many characters you should have. But this is a generally good rule of thumb because as you have longer and longer alternative text attributes, it becomes kind of more of a chore for screen reader users to kind of go through and quickly identify what images that they're being presented with. You should also give users and search engines context on how the image fits on the page. So instead of describing in minute detail that a certain image shows a man standing in a field holding a daisy with a smile on his face wearing glasses, you should focus more on giving it context within the page. So maybe this page is about purchasing glasses. The alternative text attribute can be man wearing glasses, for example. Less is usually more with alternative text attributes, and just giving a general idea is good enough. You don't need to give painstaking detail into what's happening in an image. And one really important thing that I see not done as often as it should be is making sure that alternative text attributes are used kind of properly and in a semantically correct way. So making sure that if, for example, the image is purely decorative, the alternative text attribute is empty. So it has two quotation marks with no space in between if it's decorative. That's a really common error I see. Sometimes there's an actual space, sometimes there's a not applicable. This isn't a great experience. What we want ideally for a decorative image is for a user who is using a screen reader to be able to tab through the page and kind of skip right past the image. If it's decorative and it serves no real purpose on the page, then we shouldn't have an alternative text attribute for it. It should be empty. Another thing that is going to be manually tested is keyboard navigation. So this is a really important one that's pretty difficult for automated tools to detect. So we need to make sure when we're testing for keyboard navigation that a person using assistive technology, whether that's in the form of a keyboard only or a sip and puff device where they're able to blow air to kind of replicate a tabbing action, we want to make sure that they're able to navigate through all the interactive parts on the page. So, for example, we want to make sure that when they're tabbing through the page, that they don't skip over things like little widgets on the page or iframes, things like that. We also want to make sure that there is always a visible focus indicator present on actionable items. So a really simple way of this is to just not mess with it, to kind of leave the browser default and let the browser do its thing. But we're also able to get a little bit more creative when it comes to visual focus indicators. We are absolutely able to change the size, the color, the appearance, and I really encourage you to kind of let your teams know about this and let them have a little bit of fun when it comes to having visual focus indicators. I know a lot of people tend to think that visual focus indicators are kind of an eyesore, they don't look great, but it's absolutely possible to change them, customize them to match the look of your website or web app, but just make sure that they're always present and that they meet the applicable contrast ratio. So it's not enough to have a visual focus indicator present that's just like a dotted line, a gray dotted line. No one's going to see that. It needs to be visible, to be high contrast enough to be seen, and be present on all interactive elements on your page. Another thing that needs to be manually tested or at least looked at is our tables. So if your table is well-formed, it's semantically correct markup, that's a great first step, and not made of divs. I've seen so many tables made of divs. This isn't great, and it honestly sends kind of wreaks havoc on screen reader users, and it doesn't communicate the same information that semantically correct tables do. There are a lot of different kind of tags and attributes that are associated with tables that are all there for a very specific reason. It's important to make sure that data tables are correctly marked up so that we can show the relationship between the information and the header cells, which is super, super important for someone navigating with a screen reader, for example. They need to know kind of how to associate which headings and which rows with which information. So that always needs to be present. And the best way to do that is to test your tables yourself with a screen reader. Go through and see if you understand the relationship between different headings and cells. And one generally good rule of thumb is if you find the table complex to just to navigate yourself and to understand, then someone using a screen reader who perhaps has vision loss is going to have an even more difficult time being able to navigate your table. So yeah, with tables, even when they are well marked up, they can still get extremely confusing. You can have like side scroll. And when we start to have tables that look that complex, even when they are semantically correct, they're extremely difficult to navigate. And in that case, I would really encourage you to question if this table is even necessary, kind of what end is it trying to achieve, and can this information be conveyed in a different form? So this is one aspect of kind of ethical accessibility testing, making sure you're doing the right thing. Just because this table works and is semantically correct does not mean that a person who is non-sighted could feasibly, easily navigate it, understand the information. So yeah, just because you can create elements like this doesn't mean you should. I really encourage us all to really question why we're doing certain things, following certain patterns. I think an ultimate goal of mine when I'm designing is to make sure that the designs are so simple that someone who's never used a computer before can make sense of the page that I'm working on. So yeah, tables, think about them and ask yourself if they are the best way to represent the information that you're wanting to represent. We also have form errors. That's another thing that needs to be manually tested. So automated testing tools can, yes, catch if you have form errors present, but the area gets a little gray when it comes to the actual functionality of them. So we want to make sure that labels are associated with form controls programmatically. We don't want labels that are just like kind of floating on the side that aren't associated with the form controls, or labels that are placed too far from the form controls. Reasonably, labels should be placed as close to the form control as possible so it's apparent visually that they are related and that it is labeling that form label. Another kind of issue that I see really often with forms is having placeholder text. Now, I would really encourage you, whenever possible, to not have any placeholder text present on your website. I have a blog post about it that you can visit to kind of get more detail about why placeholder text is so terrible. But on a very high level, basically, placeholder text is always low contrast. It's always kind of difficult to read. If placeholder text is the only way that you're labeling your form field, it becomes extremely difficult when users are filling in your form to remember what they were even filling out if the label is constantly disappearing. But also when users are using high contrast mode, for example, that kind of inverts the color so that the background becomes very dark and the text becomes lighter, placeholder text is indistinguishable from regular text. So users are no longer able to tell if a form field has already been filled out or if it's just placeholder text. Now, this is also a really great example of ethical accessibility testing. Most automated testing tools will not pull out placeholder text as a problem, but it is a problem. It's difficult for screen reader users who may or may not hear the placeholder text read out. It's difficult for people with cognitive disabilities to have to remember whether or not they filled out a field correctly. And it's also problematic for people who use high contrast mode on their computers. So even though your tool is probably not going to flag this, from placeholder text is problematic on a certain level when it comes to following several WCAG guidelines, including having enough contrast with the background. Um, as far as forms go, we also want to make sure that the error messages make sense and tell the user exactly how to fix their errors. So a lot of times we'll see form errors that turn red or that kind of have an animation to show that that the information is not being accepted, but we need to go a level further and make sure that we actually help the user fix the errors. Making sure that the text is associated with the label. So when a screen reader lands on the label, it's able to read out the error message to the user. They don't have to search for it. But also making sure that when a user tries to submit and they make an issue and they make a mistake, take their focus indicator back to the first field where they've made a mistake. Make sure that you guide them through the process of fixing this mistake and continuing in whatever flow that they're in. Um, this is another aspect of ethical design, ethical accessibility testing. Yes, technically, does it work if you have the error messaging present? Yes, it does, but why don't we go that extra mile to make sure that they're actually helping users fix the issue, not just telling them what it is, but leading them to the answer and moving them through the flow as seamlessly as possible. Another thing that needs to be manually tested are ARIA roles. So when I say ARIA roles, I'm referring to ARIA, which is Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And they're kind of roles that can be added to HTML to define how content and applications can be accessible to users with disabilities. And I know that ARIA is a bit of a tough one to wrap your head around. It definitely was for me. But yeah, ARIA can be really complex, but overall, ARIA is very widely overused. I think because it is complex and it's a little bit difficult to understand, people kind of go to like the complete extreme and just sprinkle ARIA roles in everywhere, which are both it's unnecessary but also problematic for people using screen readers because they're hearing things being read out more than once. So the most overused ARIA roles I would say are ARIA label and ARIA described by. Overall, when you run this through any sort of automated testing tool, usually ARIA roles are marked as a feature. So regardless of where you're using them, kind of, your tool will probably tell you, oh, you're using ARIA roles, that's great. But it's only great if it's helpful. So ARIA label, for example, I see it used really often to label, for example, heading elements at the top of a list. So, for example, I'll see a list in the footer of a page that says shopping, and then it'll be labeled ARIA label equals shopping. If the item already says what it is, like shopping, you don't need to again ARIA label it to indicate the same thing. Generally, ARIA labels should be used when you're not able to communicate directly through text what exactly the element is doing. ARIA described by is also a very commonly overused one, and it tends to be overused a lot when we're looking at list items. A lot of times people use ARIA described by to label list items as and associate them with kind of like their heading item, which is unnecessary. If you have a properly marked up list, screen reader users will be told what the heading is and then be read out every single item on the list and told which item it is out of the total number of items in a list. So by and large, the more ARIA labels and ARIA described bys you have, the more likely it is that you're using them a little bit redundantly. So this is a big one that that automated testing tools don't accurately pick up, but can really shape a user's experience of our pages. ARIA can be really complex, and I think that's why it tends to be so overused. I would definitely encourage any testers, developers in the room who regularly work with ARIA to take the time to understand it, how powerful it can be, but also its repercussions on screen reader users. Throwing in ARIA labels and describe bys in your code might not be seen by most users, but the effects can definitely be experienced by screen reader users. So yeah, this is a big one that I think more attention needs to be paid to, but also needs to be closely monitored via manual testing. Context changes. So another thing that needs to be manually tested. Basically, when I'm referring to context changes, I'm referring to like when an element receives focus, it shouldn't trigger any sort of context change on the page. So if a user hits a tab in an accordion, the entire page surrounding the accordion should not change. And if there are minute changes, say within the accordion, within the tabbing system, then the user should be alerted to that via some sort of announcement or alert. It's really important to announce context changes because for non-sighted users, a change in context on the page can mean the difference between understanding what's going on the page and being on an unusable page where you have no idea where you are on the page. Context changes can wreak a lot of havoc, and of course, this is something that's very difficult for automated testing tools to pick up. Even if they do pick up the fact that something's on the page have changed, they're not really able to determine if this changes to the extent that users would no longer understand which position they are on the page. This is definitely kind of a human thing that needs to be tested objectively by a human to determine if a context change is acceptable, if it's very minute, or if it's something that will result in a user being disoriented on a page. Timing. Timing is another really important one. Perhaps not something that's as common, but something that accessibility testing tools, automated ones, would definitely have a difficult time picking up. If there's a time limit on the use of your page, the user should have ample warning as well as the option to extend their time on the page. So I would really strongly advise against using time limits on a page unless it's absolutely strictly necessary, just to avoid situations where users are unnecessarily booted off pages when it's not necessary. Readability. So humans are the very best at testing readability. Of course, you could write a script that looks through for certain spelling errors on your page, but again, that's not really in the spirit of having accessible content or text. Humans are your best resource to look into this. There are also tools that determine the readability of text based on a certain set of criteria, which varies depending on what engine you're using. So there are some tools that I've encountered, but actually I haven't encountered one that I'm totally sold on it based on the explanation that the developers give of how it works, as well as it being free to access. So if you have any tools that help you determine readability, that are open source, transparent about how they assess this, and that are free, please share them in the chat box. I would love to see those. So small details that make a big difference will not be caught by automated tests. Things like placement of the language selection option, which ideally, if your website allows users to change locale or language, it should be in the top left-hand corner of the page, one of the first things that your user encounters, because if they can't speak a certain language, they really probably don't want to spend time tabbing through your entire page in order to find the ability to change their language. Is your carousel an infinite loop? Is your carousel extremely difficult to exit for users using a keyboard? And do you and your team put effort into creating accessible products? I hear a lot from clients who are worried about getting sued, but getting sued is kind of done when an experience is so frustrating that it's absolutely impossible for the user to reach their goal. So by and large, I think if your team is really working to make things accessible and has the spirit of accessibility in mind, it's a lot less likely that you will be sued. Minute mistakes happen, but what's really important is kind of making sure that accessibility is considered in all aspects and being willing to listen, especially to testers with disabilities who will probably be able to point out a lot of your issues that would affect people with disabilities. So for accessibility, the manual parts, we've talked about quite a few things, including how automated tools are helpful and can play an important role in accessibility testing, but manual testing still has an important place. And for the foreseeable future, until we have the technology, humans are going to have to be a part of remediating accessibility issues. Be very wary of tools claiming to fix 100% of your accessibility issues. They just don't exist. The technology to do that just doesn't exist yet, and it's flouting a lot of the spirit of actually making things accessible. So I would definitely encourage you to be critical of tools like this and to approach them warily. Yeah, that was my talk about accessibility testing, the manual parts. I hope that was helpful to you and kind of shed some light on what kind of things we need to keep an eye out for when we're testing outside of automated tools. I really appreciate you tuning in. Feel free to tweet me or visit me online at my on my website. I do write blog posts on accessible design and development once in a while. So yeah, be sure to check that out. Thank you for your time. I'm gonna try and get Ina and Stephanie to share this slide deck with you in case you'd like to refer back to it for any reason.
Yeah, I think that would be great. First of all, thanks, Tolu. I learned a lot, and
Awesome.
yeah, my colleague and mine, we were just discussing like, okay, there's a lot, right? And
Yeah, there's a lot.
it's probably just the surface that we scratched today. I feel like you could talk for this about this for at least another hour, or
Oh, absolutely.
maybe there's time for for a workshop one of these days, because I think it's always good to already have a look at the tools and practically kind of get into the whole topic, because it's a lot, and it's probably going to be more with improvement in websites. There's always going to be
Yeah,
improvement to be done on accessibility. So
yeah.
thanks, and there's a lot
Oh,
of
of
discussion
course.
going on in the
Oh,
chat.
awesome.
Yeah, like I said, I'm going to send this to you later anyway, but there's actually a few tools that have been shared about readability. So thanks, people, for for showing your your experience and sharing your tools with us. So that's really cool. And there's also a few questions that popped up, so I'd rather just jump into those. Maybe there's more coming in. So, but first of all, thanks, Tolu. That was really good.
Oh, absolutely. I hope it was helpful and yeah,
Yeah.
shed some light on some things that we don't often discuss. It's in no way an exhaustive list, but definitely the most common issues that I see.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump right into the questions here. So first one, which I think that came to my mind as well. So both people voted for that. Do you feel there's a difference between accessibility and usability?
That's a great question. I feel like the two definitely overlap quite a bit. And for one, I'm talking to clients that they find it very hard to wrap their minds around like accessibility, why it's necessary. Usability is often a really great way to explain it to them. All of these, a lot of things that we see on WCAG guidelines for accessibility, if they're implemented, they also lead to like greater usability on websites. I don't think they're the exact same thing, but I think they are very closely twined, and doing one can definitely like create the other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good answer. All right, so we'll jump right to the next one here. Um, which roles in an organization do you think should be involved in manual testing, especially when it's a small organization?
Oh, I love this question. This is an awesome question. Obviously, this is very much my opinion, and I've encountered a lot of people with different opinions, but I genuinely believe that accessibility is everyone's responsibility and that everyone involved in different parts of the process can help with testing the things that they've created. I think the best person to look at accessibility issues with code is probably a developer or a QA engineer. And the best person to help with accessibility issues with design is probably a designer. With content, probably a content strategist, UX writer. I firmly believe that it's everyone's job and that we can all be QA testers for our own kind of domain. QA testers do have a lot on their plate with all these different things to keep in mind. But if we at our own individual levels make sure that we're keeping accessibility in mind, it kind of stops that bottleneck from happening and creates an easier time for them to pick out the issues that they should be focusing on as QA people.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to already just raise the awareness of that those things are
Yeah,
there and that we can actually improve them. And if there's anyone in the team that goes through the website and feels that that's an issue, then they can just come up with us to us.
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think having the awareness already that we can improve and that there are issues for people with disabilities, then that's already a big step to my mind. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I think everyone needs to be involved to
yes,
like ensure the most successful result.
yeah. All right. So next question: do you have any tools which you use for testing accessibility?
Yes, I do. So, when I'm doing accessibility testing myself, I've been doing it for a while, so I kind of have a checklist in my mind of things that I'm looking for. But I usually like to start with tools like the Wave toolbar and just get an overall sense of things that are easily picked up by a machine that are a little bit tougher for me to pick up. So things like, is the contrast ratio
Mhm.
all right? And automated tools are excellent at doing that. I love using them for that. But beyond that, and some like issues like a label isn't associated with the form field or alternative text attribute is missing. I find that that's pretty much all I'm able to pull out from automated tool. And then I need to go in again and test with a screen reader as well as tabbing through. And depending on the scope of the testing, it might also involve testing on devices like iPads and phones as well. But I definitely think automated tools have a place and they're great as a starting off point. But like I said, like 30% of the things you're going to catch, you're going to do with those tools, and the rest is going to have to be someone sitting down, testing, and looking at user goals versus how the application works.
Yeah. Alright. So the next one, keyboard navigation is really hard.
Yeah,
Do you subscribe to the idea of less is more with website design?
that's a really good question as well. These questions are awesome. Yes. So again, this is very personal. Different designers have different opinions. I personally think that less is more. I'm never happier than when I see a website that's not very visually cluttered, that things are well spaced out, that there's a lot of white space. I personally find it a lot easier to process. And these websites are also great for people with cognitive disabilities. There's a lot more kind of space to consider things. Things are well spaced out and kind of don't pull your attention in different ways. I love minimalism. I think less is more. But again, this is totally a personal opinion, and you'll find designers that believe the complete opposite. I just genuinely think that simple, usable interfaces are the least obtrusive, and we just like let users let users go through the flow and achieve their goals without kind of bogging them down with anything unnecessary.
I agree. Next one is very good as well. How would you go about screen reading graphs?
Graphs. That's a great one. So a lot of the time, when I try to go through and test graphs with screen readers, I can't. They're something that's very commonly done in an accessible way. It might be an iframe that's not well embedded. It might just be an image, which tends to be the most common case.
Mhm.
There are definitely ways to make certain types of graphs accessible, and I'm actually working on a blog post about that. But a lot of times, it might not be possible to make a graph accessible. Sometimes it's just so complex that, like, perceivably, someone who doesn't see will just have a really hard time kind of being able to visualize or grasp what's going on. In those cases, again, I would encourage whoever is working on this, designers, developers, to really take a step back and consider if this is the best way to show what they're trying to communicate. Sometimes graphs can be helpful, and maybe the best solution is to have a little write up that explains what's happening in the graph, or to have a very simple chart that shows what's happening in the graph. That's definitely an option, but yeah, most of the time I find that graphs are difficult to make accessible, but there are ways to do it. Again, in the spirit of being accessible, even if your chart is accessible, considering having an alternative for people who just visually have a difficult time grasping it or can't see and might have a difficult time grasping it. I know that's long-winded, but yeah.
All right. So next one. Yeah. How can we distinguish between label and placeholder?
Oh, that's a great one. So,
They're all good.
they're all awesome questions.
Mhm.
So a label is generally placed outside of a form field to tell a user what the form field is indicating. But a placeholder is kind of what you'll see in like giving you an example. For example, if you're entering your email in a certain text box, a lot of them will have example at email.com. That's in a very light, difficult to read font. That's a placeholder, and those should be avoided at all costs. They're just not helpful, and they wreak havoc on screen reader users. If your label is descriptive enough, you shouldn't need to have placeholder text.
Yeah.
Consider giving tips when the user has made an error, but kind of assume that if you say name, someone knows what needs to go in that field and doesn't need an indicator for that.
Yeah. You touched on that in your talk as well. So,
Yeah.
all right. Then there's another question. Is there a reading level you should aim for? High school, university, and so on?
That's also an awesome question. So I was actually reading about this not too long ago, and I think generally the reading level that we should aim for is about grade 6 to grade 8 to make sure that the majority of people are able to kind of understand what's being described on that page. And I would really encourage that to try to adhere to that reading level. I think anything beyond grade 8, I mean, we just don't know how many people are able to comprehend at that level, but also culturally, people whose first language isn't English, like it helps to have a simpler reading level just to create the most access for the most amount of people.
Yeah. With an existing project, where would you start to adjust accessibility? Do you have something like a checklist that you can share?
Oh, that's a really good one. I mean, I can make one. Um,
Okay.
for yeah, I can make one and share it, but it's tough because I feel like there's just so many things to keep track of. It honestly can be really overwhelming to try and like narrow it down and make a list of all the things you can check. Um, I know some people kind of will skim through the WCAG guidelines, which can be a little long-winded to try and skim through all of them to make sure you're adhering to all of them. But yeah, I can definitely write a blog post along those lines. I think that would be super helpful to create a
Let us know when
checklist
you have done
story.
it.
Sorry?
I said, let us know when you've done it.
Oh, definitely.
That would be really good. Yeah, but as you said, I think every website is also coming from a different history and background. Like, how old is it? How many people have developed it? How
Yeah.
many tools are connected to it? What applications are implemented? It's so hard, I think, to have one unique one, but it would be great as a start, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
All right. While testing, should we follow single page approach or a single success criteria approach? That is, should we test all the criteria on a single page or should we test a single criteria on all the pages?
That's a good question. First, I would look at the type of application that you have. So, say you have an application that's using templates, you probably don't need to test every single page. When the templates are the same, if you don't have any unique or special widgets or elements, you can probably just test against all the different template kind of pages you have. What I tend to do is well, first, I think you need to determine scope, especially when it's an existing project. Like, determine scope of what you're testing because you can't test everything in one go. And once you kind of have the scope, that'll help you narrow down which pages you're looking at one time. But typically, I'll go through one page from top to bottom and make sure that I think it is as accessible as possible. I think when you're looking one criteria at a time, it becomes really tedious. But then you're also going through a list of like 80 different things. That's a lot of work. I think going through the page, running an automated testing tool to start, and then using a screen reader and having a look at the code if you're able to, you'll catch most of the errors on the page that way. So I would not recommend kind of one criteria per page. I would define a scope and look at one page at a time and then try and make sure it fits all the criteria.
Yeah. All right, and the last question for now. Do you have any tools which help you pull information out to aid your manual testing? Wave toolbar is great, for example.
Any tools? Honestly, Wave Toolbar is probably the main tool that I use when I'm doing accessibility testing. Again, I've been doing it for long enough that I'm pretty comfortable kind of going through the page and like and knowing what kind of issues that I'm looking for the most common issues first, and then using a screen reader and tabbing through. That's pretty much the only tool I use, but I think with time it definitely becomes easier. I would encourage you to use a tool and then maybe look at the most common things first. So we
Yeah,
know that often alternative text attributes are done wrong, so look at those. We know that often ARIA roles are used incorrectly, so have a look at the ARIA roles. And I would just go from there, from the most common ones first, and then going through again with a screen reader and keyboard. But I would emphasize that a screen reader is absolutely so important in catching most accessibility issues. It should definitely be a part of testing. And then the keyboard, like tabbing through the keyboard, is also really important. But I think if you do those things, you will catch most things on the page. Yeah.
that's all the questions, and we're just at 1 hour.
Awesome.
But like I said, I think we could go on for quite a bit, and
Yeah.
yeah, it would be like, to my mind, it would be great to have a workshop one of these days, maybe, and.
Yeah.
Yes, and also, yeah, I think for everybody who has watched here, and also for you, Tolu, as soon as we have some news about the list you might come up with, or something that we might think might be useful for that, because we feel that there's a lot of things that we can still optimize in this field,
Yeah.
and then we will share it definitely on social media and make sure everybody knows.
Awesome.
That would be great. So
Awesome.
people, thanks so much for tuning in and for your great questions, and also for your answers, Tolu, and for all the links that have been shared. I think that would be great. Maybe we'll put together a blog post ourselves and add all these links, because, like I said, we feel that there's still, room left to
Yeah.
optimize. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. This is so much fun.
Yes, we found the same. And to everybody who watched, see you all soon. And make sure to tune in next time in 2 weeks. You will hear more about the next webinar soon on social media. And if not, we'll hopefully see each other in November. Stay safe and healthy. And thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.